The worn leather of the Homestead deed felt slick in Elias's grip. It was a hot August afternoon in 1899, but the sweat on his palm was cold. A strange smell hung in the air around their new cabin, a sweet smell, like honey, but underneath it was something else, something like the smell of meat that's been left out in the sun too long. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the paper in his hands. This was it. 160 acres of Oklahoma prairie, all theirs. The promise he'd made to his wife, Clara, and their 7-year-old daughter, Maisie, was now a physical thing he could hold. He looked over at them. Clara was holding Maisie's hand, her eyes scanning the horizon. Their wagon was parked by the simple one-room cabin, its boards weathered a soft grey. This was the moment he'd worked for, saving every dollar from his 5 years of carpentry work back in St. Louis. He walked over to them, the tall grass whispering against his trousers. "Well," Elias said, his voice sounding too loud in the wide, quiet space. "This is it. This is home." Clara smiled, but it was a careful smile. It didn't quite reach her eyes, which were the color of a winter sky. She tucked a strand of brown hair behind her ear. "It's certainly peaceful," she said. Peaceful wasn't the word Elias would have used. The land was alive with sound, but none of it was familiar. The buzz of insects was a constant hum. A hawk cried out somewhere high above. The wind moved through the grass in long, sighing waves. And underneath it all, that odd, sweet smell. "Let me show you the boundary," Elias said, wanting to pull her into his dream. He led them to the northwest corner of their property, where a rough stone marker was half buried in the earth. He put a hand on Clara's shoulder, feeling the familiar curve of it under her cotton dress. He pointed. "The stream is just over that little rise. Perfectly good water. And see where the land flattens out? That's where we'll put the big house next spring. 2 stories, with a real glass window for you to look out of." He painted the picture with his words, just as he had 100 times on the long journey west. A garden for Clara. A pony for Maisie. A legacy. Safety. A place where no factory whistle could ever wake them, where the air was clean, and their future was their own to build. Maisie, her small face serious under her sunbonnet, crouched down to watch a line of red ants marching across the dirt. Clara's gaze, however, kept drifting past him, past the stream, to a dense, dark line of blackjack oaks that marked the eastern edge of their land. The trees looked ancient and knotted, their leaves a deep, shadowy green. "The man in Guthrie," Clara began, her voice quiet. "The one who sold you the deed. He was in an awful hurry to leave, wasn't he?" Elias chuckled, squeezing her shoulder. "Mr. Henderson? Oh, he was a city man through and through. Talked a mile a minute. I think the sheer quiet of this place scared him. He probably heard a coyote howl one night and packed his bags before sunrise. He kicked a clod of earth, watching it break apart. His fear is our good fortune, Clara. We got this land for a song." "It wasn't just fear in his eyes, Elias," Clara said, turning to look at him directly. "It was like he was guilty. He couldn't meet my gaze. He just kept counting the money you gave him, over and over." "Well, he's gone now," Elias said, his tone firm, final. "And this is ours. Nothing here but good earth and clean air." He believed it. He had to believe it. He had poured every hope, every coin, into this patch of prairie. Doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. The noon sun was a white, burning coin in a sky bleached of its blue. Time seemed to stand still under its heat. They turned and walked back toward the cabin. Maisie ran ahead, her laughter a bright, tiny sound in the vastness. Clara walked beside him, her arm linked in his, but he could feel the tension in her. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with all the things she wasn't saying. "The quiet out here," Clara whispered finally, her voice barely audible over the rustling grass. "It's too heavy." Before Elias could answer, a gust of wind, stronger than the others, sliced across the field. It bent the grasses flat and whipped Clara's skirt around her legs. It carried with it a new sound from the direction of those blackjack oaks. A low, shuddering moan that didn't sound like any animal Elias knew. It was a human sound, full of ache. And the moment it faded, another sound cut through, a crisp, metallic asterisk click star. It was unmistakable. The sound of a hammer being drawn back on a rifle. Elias froze. Every muscle in his body went tight. He pushed Clara gently but quickly behind him, his eyes locked on the wall of trees. Nothing moved. The trees were just a silent, dark mass. Elias. Clara's voice was tight with fear. "Shush," he said, his own heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. He stared until his eyes ached, searching for a shape, a shadow, a glint of metal. There was nothing. Only the leaves trembling in the wind. The buzzing insects had gone quiet. The world seemed to be holding its breath. After a full minute, Elias forced himself to relax his shoulders. He let out a long, slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "It's nothing," he said, turning to her. He tried to make his voice sound easy, convincing. "The wind plays strange tricks out here. Makes noises. And that click could have been a branch snapping. Drywood sounds just like that sometimes." He saw the doubt in her eyes. She'd heard it too. The perfect, mechanical sound of a gun being made ready. But she also saw the desperate hope in his. The need for his dream to be real. "Let's get you and Maisie inside," he said, guiding her toward the cabin. "We'll unload the wagon. Make the place feel like home. I'll get a fire going." He worked with a frantic energy for the rest of the day. He hauled their furniture, the oak bedstead, the pine table, Clara's rocking chair, into the cabin. He mended a loose step on the porch. He chopped firewood until a sizable pile grew by the door, the steady asterisk thwack asterisk of the axe a comforting, normal sound. Each swing was a denial of that moan, a rejection of that click. Later, as the sun began to sink, painting the sky in oranges and purples, they sat at their table for their first meal in their new home. A simple stew cooked over the fireplace. Maisie chatted about the ants and a grasshopper she'd seen. Clara passed the bread, her movements calm, but her eyes kept flicking to the single window, now a square of deepening black. That night, after Maisie was asleep on her little cot, Elias lay beside Clara in their new bed. The cabin was full of unfamiliar night sounds, the settling of logs, the scuttle of some small creature in the roof thatch. Moonlight streamed through the window, painting a silver rectangle on the floorboards. "We'll be happy here, Clara," Elias whispered into the darkness. "You'll see. This is a fresh start. For all of us." Clara didn't answer for a long time. Then, she simply reached over and found his hand, lacing her fingers with his. Her grip was tight. She didn't say she believed him, but she held on. That had to be enough for now. Outside, the prairie was dark and immense. The blackjack oaks were just a deeper shadow against the night. And somewhere out there, a question hung in the still, sweet air, unanswered. The sound had faded, but the echo of it remained. Whose rifle? And more importantly, what were they aiming at? The next 2 weeks on the homestead passed in a strange kind of rhythm. The days were measured by work, Elias deepening the well, Clara starting her vegetable patch, Maisie collecting smooth stones from a stream. But the nights were measured by silence, and the listening that filled it. Elias would wake in the dark, his body stiff, his ears straining for a sound that never seemed to come again. He'd watch the moonlight trace a path across the floor, and he'd see Clara's eyes, open and watching the same path. The easy sleep they'd known in their rented room in St. Louis was gone, replaced by a shallow, alert rest. You could see the cost of it in the faint purple shadows that settled under Clara's eyes, and in the way Elias's hands would sometimes tremble slightly before he clenched them into fists. He spent most of his time at the well. The previous owner, Mr. Henderson, had started it but hadn't gone deep enough before the water gave out. So Elias dug. The work was hard, back-breaking under the late August sun. The asterisk scrape-thud asterisk of his shovel biting into the earth became the soundtrack of his days. He told himself he was digging for water, for their future. But part of him knew he was digging to drown out the memory of that metallic click. With every shovelful of dirt, he was trying to bury his own doubt. He found other things, too, while working the land. Behind the small barn, where the grass was thin, he found long, deep scrapes in the hard soil. They weren't from an animal's digging. They were too straight, too parallel. They looked like something heavy had been dragged, not once, but many times, along the same track. He stood looking at them one afternoon, the hair on his arms standing up despite the heat. He took his boot and scuffed at the marks until they were blurred. Then he walked away and didn't mention it to Clara. But she saw the change in him. He carried his shotgun with him now, even just to collect firewood from the pile by the porch. His axe was always leaning within reach. His laughter, which used to come easy and loud, was now a short, quiet sound. He jumped at the cry of a distant hawk. One evening, as they sat shelling peas on the porch, Clara put a hand on his arm. Her fingers were cool from the bowl. "Elias," she said softly, "this isn't living. We are jumping at shadows. Maybe we should think about going back to Guthrie for a while, just until we figure things out." He looked at her, saw the genuine fear in her eyes, and felt a surge of something hot and defensive in his chest. Going back meant admitting he was wrong. It meant his dream was fragile. It meant the money was gone for nothing. "A man doesn't run from his own land, Clara," he said, his voice firmer than he intended. "This is ours. We can't let nerves chase us off. That's just what loneliness feels like at first. It plays tricks on you." He saw her pull back, saw the hope in her face shudder closed. She went back to shelling peas, her movements precise and careful. "These aren't tricks, Elias," she said, but so quietly he almost didn't hear. That night, he made his decision. He would post a watch. He would be the protector. He would prove to her, and to himself, that they were safe. After Clara and Maisie were in bed, he took his shotgun, a blanket, and a lantern turned down low. He settled himself with his back against the solid wood of the cabin door, the cool night air on his face. He would stay awake. He would stand guard against the unseen. This was his first, irreversible choice, to plan his fate and fight the unknown, instead of turning away from it. The hours crawled by. The prairie at night was a symphony of tiny sounds: crickets, the whisper of the wind, the distant yip of a fox. Every one of them made his heart skip. His eyes felt gritty from staring into the darkness toward the blackjack oaks. By the time the sky began to lighten from black to a deep, watery blue, a false sense of peace had settled over him. Nothing had happened. Maybe Clara's nerves were getting the better of them both. Maybe the sounds that first day had been the wind. Stiff and tired, he stood up, his joints popping. He decided to check the well before turning in. He walked across the dewy grass, the world silent and still in that moment just before dawn. The stone rim of the well was cold and damp under his palms. He leaned over, peering down into the darkness. He couldn't see the bottom. He went to pull up the bucket to check the water level. As he grabbed the rough, thick rope, his boots slipped on the wet stone. He lurched forward, his stomach dropping. Instinctively, he gripped the rope harder to stop his fall. And that's when he felt it. The rope was coarse in his hands, but his fingers found grooves in it. Not the usual fraying or wear. These were deep, smooth cuts, carved into the fibers. They were fresh, the exposed strands inside still pale and clean. Someone had been here. Someone had used this rope, recently and with great force, for something that wasn't drawing water. His breath caught in his throat. All the tiredness vanished. He lowered the lantern on its own rope, his hands now steady with a cold, clear focus. The circle of yellow light wobbled and descended into the pit. 20 feet down, just above the dark mirror of the water, the light caught on something metallic, something wedged into the clay wall of the well. It was a hook. A huge, rusted iron hook, like something from a butcher shop or a warehouse. It was pounded deep into the earth, and around its thick curve, he could see the same deep grooves, a perfect match for the marks on the rope above. This hook wasn't for buckets. It was for holding weight. A lot of weight. A sound from the cabin made him jerk his head up. Little Maisie was standing on the porch in her nightdress, her hair a messy halo around her face. She was asleep, her eyes open but seeing nothing. She took a few steps into the yard, stopped, and spoke one clear sentence into the morning air. "The well man is cold," she murmured. Then she turned, padded back inside, and was gone. Elias stood frozen, the lantern light still glowing from the hole in the ground. The first real sunbeam broke over the horizon, painting the prairie gold. It should have felt warm. It felt like a spotlight. The hook was old, its rust deep, but the grooves in the rope were new. So someone had been here. Someone had used this well for something terrible, and recently. The question that had haunted him for 2 weeks twisted into a new, sharper shape. It wasn't just Asterisk whose rifle star. It was Asterisk. What had they been doing down there? Asterisk. The hook in the well changed everything. That rusty piece of iron was a fact, a hard, cold truth that Elias couldn't shovel over or ignore. The vague fear that had been haunting them now had a shape. For the next month, a strange energy took hold of Elias. The proud, hopeful builder was gone. In his place was a man obsessed. He stopped working on the garden fence. He barely tended the firewood pile. Instead, he began to search. He started with the small, leaning shed the previous owner had left behind. Clara would watch him from the cabin window, a deep line of worry between her brows, as he spent hours inside the dark little structure, the sound of him moving crates and barrels drifting across the yard. One afternoon in late October, he found them. Not tools or seed bags, but a small wooden box, shoved into a space between the wall studs. Inside were ledgers. They weren't records of corn or cattle. The columns were marked for shipments received by a Henderson and Company. But the items listed made Elias's mouth go dry. Lime. Quicklime. Barrels of it. The dates went back 3 years, and the amounts were huge, far more than any single homestead would ever need for dressing a field. He sat back on his heels in the dusty shed, the ledger open in his lap. A sliver of cold light cut through a crack in the wall, illuminating the careful, looping handwriting. Lime. He knew what that was for. Everyone did. It wasn't for farming. It was for making things disappear. It was for stopping a smell. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn as settled deep into his bones. The proud fantasy he'd carried, the brave protector bringing his family to a new Eden, shattered. He hadn't been a pioneer. He'd been a fool. He'd walk his wife and child into a place that another man had used, not for growing life, but for hiding death. His stubborn hope, the very thing that had driven him here, felt like a sickness now. He had been so busy listening to the sound of his own promises that he'd refused to hear the warning in Clara's voice. When he walked back to the cabin, the ledger clutched in his hand, the world looked different. The pretty stream seemed like a convenient water source for mixing lime. The sturdy cabin felt like a watchman's post. The beautiful, lonely prairie was a perfect hiding place. He saw the truth reflected in Clara's eyes when he showed her the books. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just went very pale, and her hands went to Maisie's shoulders, pulling her close. Her silence was worse than any accusation. That night, the first hard freeze of the season swept down from the north. Elias woke to a world silenced by cold. A brittle, glassy skin of ice had formed over the water bucket on the porch. When he broke it with his fist, the crack was shockingly loud in the stillness. It felt like a signal. An ending. Clara moved through the next day with a quiet, firm purpose. She took down their good quilt from the wall and began to fold it. She packed a single canvas bag with a change of clothes for her and Maisie, a little bread, and a wedge of cheese. Her movements were efficient, devoid of panic, which made them all the more terrifying. When Elias came in from checking the perimeter, his breath a cloud in the cold air, she was waiting for him. Maisie was bundled in a chair, clutching her cloth doll. "Elias," Clara said. Her voice was flat, empty of the warmth he'd known for 10 years of marriage. "We are leaving. At first light. We'll walk to the miller's farm. It's 12 miles. We can make it." He stared at her. "Leave? This is our land, Clara. We can't just abandon it." "It is not our land," she said, each word precise and cold as an ice chip. "It is a grave. and I will not let my daughter sleep on top of it another night. You can come with us. Or you can stay. But we are going. It was the impossible choice. To go meant admitting every single mistake. It meant turning his back on every dollar, every dream, every ounce of his pride. It meant walking back into the world a failure. To stay meant letting his family walk alone into the freezing prairie. It meant choosing dirt and a terrible secret over the two people he loved most. His pride roared inside him, a desperate, wounded thing. I will fix this, he said, his voice rising. I will find out what happened and I will make it safe. Running is what Henderson did. I am not him. Clara looked at him for a long, long moment. Her eyes, those winter sky eyes, seemed to look right through him, past the bluster, and see the scared man underneath. Her face, usually so soft and kind, was a mask of stone. You chose the dirt, she said. The words didn't feel like a condemnation. They felt like a simple statement of fact. He had chosen the idea of this land over the reality of his family. The truth of it hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Blind with shame and a furious, tangled grief, he turned and grabbed his axe from beside the door. He couldn't face her. He couldn't face the packed bag by the table. He stormed out into the fading afternoon light, the cold biting at his ears, and marched straight for the line of blackjack oaks. If there was a monster, he would confront it. He would drag it into the light and kill it. That would fix everything. The trees were a tangled fortress of dark branches and dry, rattling leaves. He pushed his way in, the axe held tight. He wasn't looking for a squatter's camp now. He was looking for proof. For the source. He kicked over rotten logs, peered into thickets, his anger fueling him. Near the back of the tree line, where the land began to slope down toward a rocky creek bed, he saw it. A shelf of grey limestone jutted out from the earth. And beneath it, the ground wasn't smooth. It was a jumble of stones, too many, too piled, like someone had tried to fill in a hole. His heart hammered against his ribs. He dropped to his knees and began pulling the stones away. They were heavy and cold, numbing his fingers. He worked with a frantic, mindless energy, throwing rocks behind him. The hole got deeper. And then, his fingers brushed against something that wasn't stone. Something smooth. He pulled it free. It was a piece of porcelain. A doll's head. One of its painted blue eyes was missing. The other stared up at him, blank and knowing. The china was smudged with dirt, the blonde curls chipped. It was a cheap thing, a child's toy. His blood turned to ice. He dug again, right next to where he'd found it. His fingernails scraped on metal. He pried a button loose from the dark soil. It was a large button, made of tarnished brass. He rubbed the dirt away with his thumb. He could make out the eagle, the shield. It was a button from a Union Army coat. He sat there in the gathering dusk, kneeling in the dirt, the doll's head in one hand and the soldier's button in the other. The pieces clicked together in his mind with a sound louder than any rifle hammer. The shipments of lime. The hook in the well. A lost doll. A lost soldier. This wasn't just a place where one bad thing had happened. This was a place where things were asterisk brought asterisk to be forgotten. Asterisk asterisk, and then Elias realized the promise of protection was a lie. Asterisk asterisk, he hadn't bought a sanctuary. He'd bought a secret. And in his stubborn pride, he had offered up his own family as its new keepers. The doll single, unblinking eye held his reflection, and in it, he didn't see a protector. He saw the latest fool in a long, dark story. The freezing wind moaned through the trees, but it was a quieter sound than the one now screaming inside his own head. The walk back from the blackjack oaks to the cabin was the longest of Elias's life. The doll's head felt like a burning coal in his pocket. The cold November air, which had bitten at him before, now felt like nothing. A deeper cold was inside him, one that had settled into the marrow of his bones. He had gone out there a proud man, full of bluster and anger. He came back hollowed out, silent, and finally, truly awake. Clara was standing by the fireplace when he entered. The single bag was still by the door. She took one look at his face, the dirt on his hands, the shattered look in his eyes, and her own hard expression softened, just a fraction. She didn't ask what he'd found. She didn't need to. "I'm sorry," he said, the words rough and quiet. "You were right. We'll go. First light." But as he said it, he looked out the window. The sky had turned a solid, heavy grey. The wind had a new, sharper sound to it, a whistling through the cracks in the chinking. He'd heard that sound on the plains before. A blizzard was coming. A real one. They couldn't walk 12 miles in that. No one could. For 3 days, the world disappeared. The blizzard howled around their little cabin, a white, roaring monster that shook the walls and buried the windows in dense, swirling snow. It was a strange, suspended time. The terrifying outside world was erased, but the terror inside was closer than ever. They were trapped, not just by snow, but by the secret they now shared. They spoke in hushed tones, mostly about practical things, keeping the fire fed, rationing the beans. Maisie felt the tension and stayed close to her mother, her gaze quiet and her eyes watchful. During those long, dark hours, Elias changed. His stubbornness, the very flaw that had blinded him, didn't vanish. Instead, it transformed. It hardened into a sharp, clear focus. He was no longer trying to protect a dream. He was trying to save his family from a nightmare. And he understood, with a hunter's instinct, that the person who had used that hook, who had ordered those barrels, would come. The blizzard was the perfect cover. They would expect fear, confusion, a family huddled and helpless. So he decided to use the silence and the storm as weapons. On the second day, with the wind screaming its loudest, he did something that made Clara stare. He let the fire in the hearth die down to embers. He stopped the cheerful, reassuring chatter. He moved to the window and just stared out at the white void, his shoulders slumped. He was putting on a show for an audience he couldn't see, hoping to paint a picture of a man broken and giving up. Then, he got to work. He took the rusty hook from the well, which he'd retrieved before the snows hit. He brought it inside, the cold iron smelling of wet earth and old metal. Using a length of stout rope, he fashioned a snare. He wasn't a trapper, but his carpenter's mind understood leverage and tension. He worked carefully, his fingers numb but steady. "What are you doing?" Clara whispered, her arm around Maisie. "Making sure no one ever uses this hook again," he said, not looking up. When it was done, he made his plan clear. He wouldn't hide them in the cabin. That's where an attacker would look first. Instead, he took them to the root cellar, a small, dank space dug into the earth behind the cabin. It was cold and dark, but its door was strong and could be barred from the inside. "You do not open this door," he told Clara, his voice leaving no room for argument. "No matter what you hear. You wait for my voice. Only my voice." She nodded, her trust in him, which had been so broken, flickering back to life in this new, grim version of her husband. She took the shotgun and his look told her everything she needed to know about using it. As night fell on the third day, the storm's fury began to ease, leaving behind an eerie, absolute quiet. The world was a featureless blanket of white, 2 feet deep. Elias put on his heavy coat. He took the hook and the snare, and a long, sharp hay fork from the barn. He didn't look like a hopeful homesteader anymore. He looked like part of the frozen landscape, hard, quiet, and waiting. He didn't wait in the cabin. He didn't wait in the barn. He made a blind in a drift of snow near the corner of the barn, where he could see both the cabin door and the well. He dusted himself with snow until he was nearly invisible. The cold seeped in, a painful, aching burn, but he embraced it. It kept his mind sharp. He was no longer the owner of this land. He was its patient, frozen conscience. He waited for hours. The moon emerged, casting a blue-white light over the snowfield. It was so quiet he could hear the beat of his own heart. Then he saw it. A shadow, detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the blackjack oaks. It moved slowly, carefully, across the snow, not toward the dark, silent cabin, but directly toward the well. The figure was bundled in a heavy, shapeless coat, a scarf wrapped around its face, a sack slung over one shoulder. It moved with purpose, not malice, the routine of a gruesome chore. Elias watched, his breath still. The figure stopped at the well. It brushed the snow from the stone rim. It took the rope and began to pull, hand over hand, something heavy up from the darkness. Elias thought of the ledgers. Asterisk lime star. This was the accountant, coming to settle his books. As the figure heaved a heavy, lumpy sack from the well and onto the snow, Elias rose from his blind. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He simply walked forward, the hay fork in his hands, his boots crunching with terrible loudness in the crystalline quiet. The figure froze, the sack at its feet. It turned. 10 feet apart, they faced each other under the moon. Elias could see only the man's eyes, pale and wide above the scarf. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man, tired, old, and caught. Elias nodded toward the sack, then at the hook he had laid in the snow. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and flat, carrying the full weight of his ruined dream and his newfound clarity. "The accounting is over," Elias said. The man's eyes darted from Elias's face, to the fork, to the cabin, and back to the sack at his feet. The terrible truth was right there between them, lying in the snow. The question now wasn't about the past. It was about what happened next in the freezing, silent present. The spring thaw of 1900 came slowly to the Oklahoma prairie. It was a gentle, persistent process. The sun gained strength, day by day, and the immense white blanket that had covered the land shrank back, revealing the world beneath. First came the tops of the tall grasses, bent and brown. Then the dark line of the blackjack oaks, their branches still bare. Finally, the muddy earth itself, and with it, the scars of the past winter and the homestead itself. The chipped blue door of the cabin stood wide open. Not to welcome the spring air, but to let the memories out and to carry the last of their belongings through. Clara moved through the single room with a calm efficiency. Her winter pallor was gone, replaced by a touch of color from the sun that streamed in. She folded their good quilt, the one she'd taken down in fear months before, and placed it neatly in a sturdy wooden trunk. Her movements weren't hurried or fearful. They were sure. She was building a new list in her mind, one made of practical things for a fresh start. Elias lifted the trunk and carried it out into the soft morning light. The wagon, their old wagon that had brought them here with so much hope, was now hitched and nearly full. It held a different kind of hope now, a quieter, more careful one. Elias's body moved with a new kind of strength. It wasn't the bullish strength of a man trying to conquer the land, but the lean, resilient strength of a man who had borne a great weight and was finally setting it down. A permanent tension lived in his shoulders, a souvenir from the long nights of watching, but his eyes were clear. He loaded the last crate, the one containing Clara's few dishes wrapped in cloth. The Homestead deed, that once precious piece of slick leather, now sat atop a pile of papers destined for the fireplace, a dirty, forgotten thing. He did not look at the blackjack oaks. He did not glance at the well, which was now filled with clean river stone and sealed under a thick, permanent cap of concrete he'd mixed and poured himself in the last days of the frost. That chapter was closed. The ledger settled in a way that had nothing to do with ledgers. He looked instead at his daughter. Maisie sat in the wagon bed, her legs dangling over the edge. She was holding a new doll. Clara had made it from scraps of calico during the long winter nights, with 2 matching button eyes and yarn for hair. Maisie was whispering to it, her voice a soft, happy murmur. "See the town?" she asked the doll, pointing a small finger toward the faint track that led east, toward Guthrie and the world beyond. Elias felt a lump form in his throat. She wasn't looking back at the cabin, at the garden plot now sprouting weeds, or at the silent well. Her face was turned toward the future, open and trusting. That, more than anything, told him he was making the right choice. He walked over to the porch where Clara stood, giving the empty room one last look. She took his offered hand and stepped down. Her hand in his felt familiar, but different. It wasn't the grip of someone clinging for reassurance. It was the equal hold of a partner, someone who had seen the worst and was choosing to walk forward with him anyway. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, a real, small smile touching her lips. "Ready." Elias helped her up onto the wagon seat, then walked around to climb up himself. As he did, his hand brushed against the rough wood of the wagon side. A jolt, a memory, flashed through him, not of the confrontation in the snow, but of the moment after. The silent understanding that had passed between him and the bundled man. The man had looked from the hayfork to Elias's face, and something in those tired eyes had just given up. He'd dropped the sack. He'd given a single, slow nod. Then he turned and walked back into the blackjack oaks, disappearing into the trees for what Elias knew was the last time. The secret had been seen, and in being seen, it had lost its power over the land. Elias took the reins. He clicked his tongue, and the old horse, patient and steady, leaned into its harness. The wagon wheels, hardened by the cold, crunched over the half-frozen mud, then found purchase on the softer earth of the track. They didn't talk as they rolled away. The sounds were enough: the creak of the wagon, the snort of the horse, the call of a meadowlark from a fence post. The homestead grew smaller behind them. The blue door became a distant smudge of color against the gray wood. Then it was gone, hidden by a gentle rise in the land. Elias's left hand rested on his thigh as he drove. The bright spring sun fell on it, illuminating the rough, pink scar that cut across the palm. He hadn't gotten it in the snow, or from an axe. He'd gotten it in the frantic, determined hours afterward, when he'd hauled stone and mixed concrete in the biting cold to seal the well forever. The rusty hook's chain had bitten deep into his skin as he worked to render it useless. He hadn't even noticed the cut until later, when Clara had cleaned and bandaged it. Now, it was healed. A raised line of tough skin. It was his receipt. His proof. He had promised protection and found a grave. He had offered a home and had instead delivered a hard truth. The scar was that promise, transformed. It wasn't a badge of honor, but a reminder of the cost of blindness and the price of truly seeing. The prairie around them began to change. They passed a fence line that was tended. They saw smoke from a neighbor's chimney, a friendly gray column against the vast blue sky. The sense of immense, crushing loneliness began to lift, replaced by the simple, comforting fact of other people. Maisie began to sing a little song to her doll in the back. Clara's shoulder pressed warmly against Elias's as the wagon bounced over a rut. He didn't know what came next. Maybe a job in Guthrie. Maybe a small house with neighbors close by. Maybe a future where the only thing he dug would be a garden, and the only thing he protected was the peace in his wife's eyes and the sound of his daughter's laughter. He looked at the scar on his hand, then out at the open road ahead, where the path was clear and the sun was warm. He took a deep breath of the clean, spring air, and he knew, for the first time in a long time, that they were not leaving something behind. They were traveling towards something. And whatever it was, they would face it together, with their eyes wide open.